it feels like it's something that we should do, that we should know and we should understand.
But do they give their definition, or are we saying it's any active assessment that is then acted upon and makes a change in the learners? Are we putting this together based on the paper, or do they articulate it in a certain way?
You can end up spending a lot of time digging deeper into an idea and really involving lots of students and having rich discussion and really unearthing that concept, and then it's the end of the lesson type of thing, and you haven't actually completed that exercise or whatever was set for it. And so I do see this, and I think I've certainly been guilty of it. If somebody's got the right answer, I'll just take that right answer and I'll just move on to the next thing. And we've got to remember that it's not about sort of are they correct, it's about what are they thinking underneath that.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Stuart Welsh.
Good afternoon, Kieran. Good to be back. How are you?
Yeah, very well, Stuart. Very good. You can see here I'm in the sunnier climes at the moment, although the southeast of England is pretty sunny as well. How about yourself? How are you doing?
Yes, not bad at all. Just finished a busy day at school and looking forward to having a bit of a blather with you on this episode.
It's been a while since we've had a blather. I've been Belfasting, then Research Ed Guernsey, which was fantastic. Shout out to the team in Guernsey if they're listening, and then straight over to the Costa del Sol. It's a hard life, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I hope you're not looking for any sympathy here. The best I've managed is Elgin. That's been the furthest I've travelled. So jet set lifestyle for you, Kieran. Are you heading home?
Yeah, heading home Friday, and then by the time this episode goes out, I will be knee deep in a 9-year-old's birthday party. So then the sympathy can come. So Saturday morning, if you're listening to this, pray for Kieran. We're going to explore formative assessment. End of last year, there was a meta-analysis, almost a summary paper, on the use of formative assessments, the ills and the benefits. So for those who are interested in following along, it's by Mascos, Schultz, Exwes, and Riccozzi, and it's Formative Assessment in Mathematics Education, a Systematic Review. Stuart, what is the premise of this paper?
Great, Kieran. So, formative assessment never really seems to go away, but I think that a lot of people involved in education, if you were to try and pin them down to a definition, might give you a slightly different response. It feels like it's something that we should do, that we should know and we should understand, but I think this paper's done a useful thing for us because it's really tried to dig into going beyond the claim that formative assessment is good, it works and you should do it, and it's tried to sort of interrogate what different types of formative assessment might look like, and what is more effective and what is perhaps less effective, and it does help focus our sort of definition of formative assessment. There's a lot of techniques that teachers have been exposed to and are continuing to be exposed to, but I think this paper is a chance for us to pause and really look at the efficacy of those techniques, and if there are little tweaks and adjustments to our practice that can actually make those techniques a bit more impactful.
I think it's reasonably subtle, but it goes after some big claims at the start. It's got Will.i.am and Black from the late 90s, and Paddy obviously from the early thousands, and the I suppose the talk of effect sizes. As mathematicians, we're not 100% certain whether or not we put much stock in them, but they're not rude, but they're saying there are big claims being about formative assessment. This paper has been designed to really to do what a good meta-analysis should do, and to bring light where perhaps there is none, or assumptions perhaps are made over an extended period of time. So I think really timely, because this is reportedly one of the most impactful things we can do in the classroom. So as soon as I saw the title, I was like, yes, I have to read this. What did they actually do? What was how was the paper structured?
Well, as you say there, it's a meta-analysis. So we're looking at existing studies, and I think there's 45, am I right, papers or studies that were looked at. really to try and gauge that the effectiveness of the formative assessment technique that's being employed. There was a sort of range of techniques looked at, including sort of classroom-based, paper-based, digital-based, and then sort of a discussion and a decision around, where these techniques were actually having an impact on student progress or student learning or attainment.
We started with what 550-ish papers, and then as they did their qualification process, they got down to what almost 10% of the original thing. But then I suppose that's what these really good meta-analysis does, is it really clearly defines what it's studying, and so no surprises there. But I suppose the bulk of what we're going to look at is, well, what does this then mean? So what were the key takeaways that you find from this paper? Maybe if we take one takeaway at a time.
Yeah, I think it's important that we have a sort of clear working definition of formative assessment, and that paper helped, because I think that we need to know formative assessment is more than just about checking what they know. It might well be that that's a huge part of what we do in our work in the classroom, trying to check what they know, what they understand. But for any action like that to be truly formative, it needs to help us plan our next step or our next action. It needs to be about decision making. And so that paper, one of the big takeaways for me is really just to keep that in mind, that whenever we're employing some sort of formative assessment approach or strategy, it isn't really complete until you've used the responses that you've gathered to make a decision, to plan your next step and to take that next step. And actually it then links to that idea of sort of planning, assessing, teaching being a bit of a sort of cyclic thing. And so you're always really planning. Even in the act of teaching, you should be sort of planning your next step. And you're actually always really assessing as well, because every interaction you have with a student or a group of students should really be informing your next decision. And so you've got this planning, teaching, assessing, wonderful sort of, three balls being juggled at the same time. It's not just, about giving an exit ticket or holding up a mini whiteboard. It's about defining what we're supposed to be learning. It's about thinking, how close is the student to being able to do this thing just now, and then what will it take to get them to that point. And obviously we're not saying try harder or do more examples. We need to be much more specific. So I think that's the first takeaway, is just that kind of really sort of clear idea that formative assessment is not just techniques, it's a decision-making process, and it is only kind of complete when there's an action that results. I mean, would that align with your thinking around formative assessment?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think back, I interviewed Richard Selfridge about the effective use of data, because data is used so poorly in education, and particularly primary education, as well as across all phases. And he said, it's what you do with the data that's important. And so really all you should be doing is collecting data that you can use. So I'm 100% on board with that definition. But what I'm possibly struggling to understand, and this might be bubble, is whether or not there's actually a situation where people don't use that information to act on. Is it a case of are they conflating summative and formative assessment? Are they just failing to act on it? I mean, if you imagine your colleagues at Bleep High School, is there anyone who's actually going through their lessons without being that responsive? Am I blinded by the curse of knowledge or whatever?
If I look at all the schools and classrooms that I've been fortunate enough to visit, it's a scale, isn't it? It's a scale of formative assessment techniques, whether that teacher has knowledge, has a repertoire of techniques, and then are they using those techniques? And then again, there's a scale of how effectively are they then incorporating into their decision making, as I said, what they're seeing in front of them. And so, I think the brutal answer is that there are lots of wasted opportunities in classrooms all over the world, I suppose, for teachers to get more knowledge in and to make better decisions. Mini whiteboards show me boards is such a classic example, because teachers now seem to know, right, I should be using these things, and actually I'm maybe got a nice routine now to use them with the class. But the biggest kind of advantage of those is us absorbing what we see, distilling down those results and making a decision. It's the same with exit tickets. I think that teachers know these are a useful thing and they give them out, but if they're not acted upon, then we're not getting the full kind of impact, so it doesn't become formative. So I think that there probably are lots of opportunities for all of us, including myself, to get a little bit more out of these assessment opportunities.
When we do our PD, we normally start with some sort of responsive teaching, those almost like those routines for or checking for understanding and acting on and stuff, or the use of worked examples. Like I was doing that with St. Peter's virtually, although St. Peter's is a school that has been utilising Taste Like a Champion for a long time, and so don't necessarily need as in-depth because those systems are in place. Right? So maybe it's because my recent work has been with schools like we're maybe many years down the line in terms of their journey and stuff. Because it's definitely a refinement, or we can be so much more efficient in our assessment. But maybe I've sort of not been paying attention recently to the fact that can sometimes be absent, or maybe it's less efficient and therefore, like you said, missed opportunities. That makes a whole lot of sense.
I'm going to just add that the realities of the classroom are such that teachers feel that there is some pressure to move on and to maintain a pace. And so questioning, which is essentially the core of all of our assessment, is something that you can end up spending a lot of time digging deeper into an idea and really involving lots of students and having rich discussion and really unearthing that concept, and then it's the end of the lesson type of thing, and you haven't actually completed that exercise or whatever was set for it. And so I do see this, and I think I've certainly been guilty of it. If somebody's got the right answer, I'll just take that right answer and I'll just move on to the next thing. And we've got to remember that it's not about sort of are they correct. It's about what are they thinking underneath that.
Whenever we look at the classroom, we want opportunity. We want all children thinking all the time, don't we? And then we want this definition. I think probably makes sense. Before we transition, do they give their definition, or are we saying it's any active assessment that is then acted upon and makes a change in the learners? Are we putting this together based on the paper, or do they articulate it in a certain way?
I am probably packaging this up into my own definition of formative assessment, but it aligns with what's going on in the paper, and it also aligns with the more effective formative assessment, because the paper goes on to talk about those actions. So it's a process, not just a technique, something that results in decision making. So I think that we are probably creating our own kind of mutant version of the definition, but that it aligns with effective formative assessment rather than just asking questions and getting answers and doing nothing.
I think because what we're basically going to have is like 5 ways to get the most from formative assessment kind of thing as the structure. So what's the second sort of takeaway that you've taken from this?
Yeah, and I kind of started to touch on it there. It's not about asking more questions, really. It's also not about gathering more data. There's a lot of information going around in schools already. I don't think we need to gather more. I think it's about making better use of it. And really, when I talk about making better use of it, I'm talking about improving our planning so that the largest number of pupils can move forward. You mentioned there that we want to have all pupils thinking all the time. I would add that we want to have all pupils thinking hard all the time. But even on top of that, I would like that teachers are better aware of what those pupils are thinking. And that is difficult when you've got a room of 30 and you want to try and get a sense of what they're all thinking. And that's why the questioning, this is the second takeaway, like the questioning, whether it's a task or an activity or whatever it is, we want to design these carefully so that they elicit mathematical thought rather than just right answers and wrong answers. And pupils and parents and actually teachers, they like nothing more than a big page of correct answers. Everything ticked, looking lovely, 10 out of 10. But if we're not really, asking questions or digging below the surface to try and, as I say, elicit that sort of mathematical thinking, then we're maybe not equipping ourselves with enough information to make the right decisions about what comes next. And there's a whole host of things that we could do next, depending on what we're told and what those students tell us. So, yeah, we want all pupils thinking. we want them all thinking hard, if possible, about something that they can actually achieve, but also we want teachers to know that they're thinking. How do you know pupils are thinking, and how do you know what they're thinking? And that's where those formative assessment techniques, like you mentioned, Teach Like a Champion there. I've talked about show me boards already, hinge questions, exit tickets, all of those things. If we are asking questions and creating tasks that go below the surface and get into the deeper thought, then we're getting much richer information back. Hence, we will make better decisions that push the learning forward.
I think, I know some listeners will be just happy that their pupils aren't thinking about climbing the fences, so yeah. I know, I totally get what you mean. But it's about us directing people attention. Yeah, because a lot of the conversation about questioning can often introduce, like you said, it's not about more, it's not about overcomplicating it. But I think as leaders, it's about creating this space where teachers can do that deep thinking themselves. And where that space isn't available, you're then having to put your faith in the resources that you're utilizing and the thinking that other people have done. Can the questions that have been written elicit that kind of deep thought, that kind of rich mathematical thinking? Because we know that lots of pupils only ever get a sterile sort of sanitary experience of mathematics, and that's because their teachers probably haven't had the time to do all the wonderful thinking that they want to do during their planning time. So probably an appeal to leaders to really make school improvement a subtractive process. There's so much bureaucracy we can cut, but in the absence of that as a teacher, you're probably thinking, actually, do I trust the resources? Am I going for the highest quality sort of thought process here? People have maybe been in the situation and done that deep thinking for you. So yes, I'm totally with you. And I jest about the deep thinking, because we do want all people's thinking as deeply and as difficultly and hard as possible about the mathematics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, I completely agree with that as well, because in some cases you're just glad that the student's in the room with you and that they're engaging with what's going on, and that's obviously not going to go away. But while you were talking there, I was thinking that some viewers and listeners might be thinking, well, okay, but how do we kind of go beyond the surface there? How do we go a little bit deeper? It's much easier one-to-one with students when you're talking to them, or maybe you're talking to a small group of students, because you sort of have this much more focused and controlled conversation. You can direct the narrative and pull their thinking around and set them up for the big question or the deep question. But when you've got a full group, then it becomes a bit more challenging. So we need to think really carefully. And just one little thing that kind of comes to mind is, when you are introducing a new idea and you're starting to get students maybe practicing a technique, doing some examples, what often happens is that you find that your examples kind of change and modify, and then there'll be one that's different to the others. And so even just a little small thing like having those two on the board and saying, let's have a think about these two. We've already done a lot of this. Here's a new one. It's similar, but it's different. What's different? What do you think's changed here, and how's that going to fit? And just get everybody to think about that for a moment, even if it's a sort of think, pair, share, or however you choose to do it. Just little things like that can, take the thinking from superficial to going a little bit deeper. And the other one that often works really well in the classroom is, when somebody gives you a correct answer, is to then push it all back to the room. Don't say it's right, don't say it's wrong, just push it all back and say, well, who agrees, who disagrees? And again, just takes the thinking that little bit deeper, and obviously, uses a few more moments, but moments well spent, I think, just to go that little bit deeper and set that expectation that you're looking for everyone in the room to think about these things.
Yeah, I actually did. I use dogs. Some people use birds, some people use dogs to show like the boundaries of an idea, the boundaries of a concept, and similarity and difference. And I stuck a poor wee chihuahua up on the board, and I said, "Is this a dog?" And someone said, "No, it's a rat." So I felt sorry for him, but he had small dogs, and they were really angry, so he did. So we had the Irish Wolfhound and the Chihuahua, and like the least dog and the most dog, but it probably is a rat before cat that it becomes, isn't it?
I have to be honest. I'm not a massive fan of written feedback. I don't like spending hours with a pile of jotters or notebooks in front of me, scribbling down 3 sort of sentences, because largely I know this is not going to get acted upon. I've looked into feedback before. quite often students don't actually understand the language that we're using when we give feedback. We can often give high-level, teacher-level sort of feedback to students that couldn't answer the thing in the first place. It's unlikely they're going to be able to understand the very specific language that we're using. Secondly, they might not actually know what to do anyway to then try and fix it. So although you might say, you need to take more care with this, that, or whatever it is, they won't know how to actually take that step. And so, feedback has a place, but I think it has a whole load of different forms. And so when we're talking about formative assessment, we're talking about using techniques to get a sense in our heads of what students are thinking and what they're understanding. But then we do need to take that next step and have them, we want to try and improve their understanding of their learning. And so, for me, it's not about more feedback. It's about thinking about different types of feedback and how can we get the most value from the feedback. And I think it's always got to boil back down to the actual mathematical process that's going on there. Feedback should never be about the learner. It's not a case of saying, try harder or, whatever, you're a star. Even, positive or negative stuff directed to the learner is not helping. It needs to be about the maths. And so, I think feedback can be really powerful, but it should result in an action from the pupil. There should be something that they need to do as a result. I'm sure somebody much more learned than I sort of said it should result in more work for the recipient than the giver. And I like that. And I've challenged any listeners or viewers to think, how often has the feedback that you've written into 30 notebooks, taken longer than the students have then spent acting upon it. So it should always be more work for the recipient, I think. That's why I don't do a lot of written feedback. I would tend to do whole class, verbal, small group, but feedback can also be just more examples. So if you are doing a whole class response using show me boards or whatever it is, and you see that 50% of the room have not got this, then the feedback is that you then do some more examples. Maybe simplify it, maybe go for a different representation, or maybe you get the pupils to work together and you go around the room and you just listen to what they're saying. And all of those things are kind of forms of feedback because you're giving them another chance to think about that idea, but you're putting a bit of structure and control around that so that they are now focusing more on the specifics. And I think it all ties back to those kind of clear idea of what it is we're expecting them to learn in the first instance, the learning intentions, the success criteria. I'm not a big fan of writing them on the board, but I think that students need to know what a good one looks like and what they're aiming for so that they've got that kind of target. So I think that's another takeaway for me, is that it's not about more feedback. It's about thinking about the different ways we can provide feedback. We can provide, guidance and structure around next steps, actions that are specifically tied to that bit of maths that we were learning so that those students actually improve. It's kind of closing the loop, isn't it? Or keeping that loop sort of circulating. How does that sit with you? What do you think about that? Do you like marking?
Yeah, I love marking. I spent so many weekends missing events because of it. So when sort of the narrative changed, we almost pulled the knowledge lever, and so we knew that actually written feedback was not comparable to feedback, and those effect sizes, triple marking wasn't necessarily as impactful as we might have thought. And so, but I was almost a bit disappointed that the Ofsted lever wasn't pulled, or it certainly didn't seem like reports were acknowledging that this kind of marking shouldn't still be happening. Obviously there was the myth-busting documents, but nothing really changed. There were schools I knew where people were spending countless hours marking, were getting good and above inspection ratings, even though, I think they should have held leaders accountable because it was too easy. And it's just gotten worse because of the regime change. It's got, it's so easy just to stick your head in the sand and just say, well, we've always done it this way, so we're not going to change this, So I'm disappointed that really over the last 15, 16 years, fewer schools aren't in asking their teachers to do written feedback as part of some sort of policy. But I do, and thinking of the positives back then, I think it was Dylan William, and I think it was in What Does This Look Like in the Classroom? The Carl Hendrick and Robin McPherson book. And I think he had like almost like a circle, and he said, like, dedicate 25% of your feedback to this, 25% of your feedback to that. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what it was, but I will make sure it's included in the newsletter that goes out with this episode, thinkingdeeply.info, on Monday morning, because it's really illustrative. I mean, I think he even does say like some feedback should be written. It's probably the ticking that I know you spend hours even still doing, even though you don't do written notes to your students, you still spend a lot of time actually physically marking, so you know what to do. So, no one's saying you stop looking at work, but there are more efficient ways and more impactful ways to do that. I mean, I think off the top of my head, Andrew Percival of Stanley Road has written some stuff in the past, some really good stuff about his use of almost like live feedback or whole class feedback and the structures that are in place. Just to say that, yeah, this is something I thought we would have pulled the lever on completely over the last 20 years, but we just doesn't seem to go over the line. I think that might be because many more schools that we'd like to think are silos rather than this hive mind that is evidence informed and research based in all that it does.
The sad sort of reality is that I think that written feedback into notebooks is something that's obviously very visible. It's kind of measurable from a sort of school administrative or school leadership point of view. And so, feedback's good and useful. We want to make sure every teacher's doing it. So let's just tell them that they must put it into the notebooks, and then every 2 weeks we'll look at the notebooks and check that they've written it all in there. And it just sadly, defeats the whole purpose of a lot of the things we've already spoken about here, being a little bit more responsive to the class, giving them additional examples, all that in the moment stuff that you can do in the classroom. Thankfully, schools have moved on from that, and are acknowledging that verbal feedback, is powerful and is useful. I'm not necessarily a massive fan of the verbal feedback stamp in the jotters or the notebooks, but again, the reason behind that. I think what's most important is if teachers understand that giving high quality feedback as a result of the information they've gathered through their formative assessment, if teachers understand that giving high quality feedback in whatever form it is will actually make their lives easier, students will make more progress and learning will become smoother, then teachers will be doing it. It's just a case of sharing those techniques, giving teachers support and advice so that they don't have more work, they just make better use of the time and the opportunities that they have.
Yeah, so it's the tools that they have making the sort of the collation and the decision making easier rather than more difficult, I think.
So I think the last one for me, which is interesting because we talked before about kind of digital interventions in another episode. This paper does spend a little bit of time looking at sort of online and digital computer-based kind of inventions and interventions, and it comes back saying that the computer-based can actually work pretty well, with the sort of the proviso that there is some sort of feedback. Now, feedback can just be right or wrong. I mean, just telling people if they've got it right or wrong is feedback, giving them the correct answer. Again, more than that. So these computer-based sort of approaches can work well. It's not just because it's being done online. Like, give them devices, plug them into something, get them doing practice. It's important that we kind of try and get the most out of that. And so that was a bit of a takeaway for me, is we're increasingly getting access in schools to devices and sort of whole school Wi-Fi solutions, and there's plenty of sort of platforms that provide practice and things like that. But what we're hoping here is that it's not just practice for the sake of practice, that there is this opportunity for the students to get a bit of feedback, and then ideally there's an opportunity for the teachers to make even better use of that kind of information. I was just thinking the other day, imagine if your class of 30 are all writing away in their notebooks and they're answering all these questions, and imagine if you had sight of every single answer that every single student had put in that lesson, and imagine you were able to remember all that, and yesterday's and the day before, and imagine you were able to then order that and decide where the weaknesses are, where the strengths are, who needs extended, who needs more. That is really powerful. I think that's where the digital stuff can be really helpful in this, within this formative assessment conversation that we're having.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, because that was definitely something I was going to ask about because it's a thread between last time. So obviously they were saying things like tablet-based interventions seem to be more impactful. I'm almost like I'm product spectrum on the spot here, but thinking like if it says right of your 5 questions, 3 of these were wrong, find them and correct them. That's closing that deep thinking loop as well, isn't it? I'm not sure anything actually does that. But yeah, it'd be the kind of thing that supporting effective teachers, because what I don't think we're not talking about it. We're not talking about artificial intelligence or large language models or anything. And not it's basically expertise, coding, technology to do, like you said, the heavy lifting there. That data analysis that's too much for the human brain, but it's not some sort of random. I'm not sure how to describe them, but these the claims that are being made about the power of artificial intelligence. Like it's only when you listen to people like Dominic talking about how you actually let's be a bit restrained in our thinking that actually you get the sensible element of that word. So that's not what we're talking about, but technological effects do appear. Probably most importantly, how does all of this translate into the classroom? Are there any things we can do on the ground, to make sure that we're utilizing formative assessment in the most effective way possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all teachers will be using assessment techniques in a formative way to some extent. They may have a vast range of techniques. They may have a few kind of go-to techniques. And I think it's not about necessarily being able to use every technique. You don't have to have like a hinge question, A, B, C, D coloured cards for multiple choice, exit tickets, show me boards. You don't have to have all of that going every lesson. That's really important. It's not about doing sort of more. I think it's about being consistent, using a technique that works to give you the sort of information you need back. And so, for teachers in the classroom, I would be saying that, try and have every lesson one purposely designed formative assessment activity that's designed such that it's tied to the mathematical intent of the lesson, that it's going to give you something useful. So, if it's about adding fractions, for example, and I think I always default to fractions here, but it's a ripe field for errors, because there's concepts in there, not just can they add two proper fractions, but let's really dig into the thinking around the common denominators. Why have you chosen this common denominator? Could another common denominator have also worked? Why would you not choose this one in this case? What does it mean if you end up using a larger common denominator in terms of, do you have to simplify at the end? All of those sort of things, those are the kind of mathematical thinking and the strategy, rather than just, can you do this question? You can't get it right. So I think takeaways for teachers is try and ensure that whatever formative assessment technique you're applying, it's helping you make a decision about your teaching, that your teaching then is adapted in some way, whether it is a different representation, more examples, an easier example, you split the group, somebody gets enrichment, you work with a few. It's not just about doing the technique, which I think, a lot of time for observed lessons and things like that, people will have all sorts of bells and whistles going, but really what we're looking for is, well, what did that tell you and what did you do with that information? So my big kind of takeaway and thoughts for the classroom is that, formative assessment, not a technique, but a decision-making process. I would probably add something else on here, because I've gone back and forth with pupils working together in the classroom. I think that the teacher is largely the one that's best placed to provide descriptions, to provide instruction, to provide explanations, because I've seen students, they just tell each other what to do. It's rare that the conversation is restrained and controlled and one is sort of actively teasing out thought from the other. Very rare. It's usually just a case of, you do that number, and then it's kind of done. So I've gone back and forth with this, but I do think that there still is value in having them, work together. But I think what's important here for teachers is not to say, okay, class, you've all done, an end of topic test, and I'm going to sort of give it back here and here's the answers on the screen, sort of mark each other's and then have a chat about it. I think that's just too vague and too open-ended. And so what I think I'd rather is that you have a very focused question or prompt, maybe on the board or on sort of papers, and the students are given some clear frameworks around, I want you to discuss this. This is, maybe it's a model answer. I want you to compare it to what a good one looks like. I want you to both kind of come up with how you would improve it. Something that really puts constraints around their conversation, focuses their conversation, because they are useful little tools to kind of learn from each other, especially if you want to take half a dozen and have a more focused chat with them while the rest are having that conversation. So I think those are two big things there. Whatever technique you're using, make sure it gives you some info and act on that info. Doesn't need to be loads of different techniques. And if you do choose to use kind of paired work or peer work, then keep it super focused, tie it to the learning intention success criteria, and make it about the maths.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only caveat I'd add for pupils is almost having like a really tight routine that they know how to stick to and that you can practice and rehearse if they slip out of it, because obviously, that kind of collaborative work can often go awry. But there's no reason why it can't work with proper thought. I think the first suggestion is really powerful. Because even this week I was working with a teacher and they were disappointed in the lesson that they hadn't got through the plan. And we've all been there. We've written these really detailed plans and we thought, oh, this is where we want to get to. But actually they've been really responsive and they decided to adapt their instruction based on that and say, we're not going to go any further. We're going to stick with this. And I was like, that's brilliant. But I had to reassure them actually that that's the right thing to do, because it doesn't matter what's on your paper. On paper, Paris Saint-Germain versus Bayern Munich wasn't going to be a 1-0 snooze fest, but it was, because you don't survive first contact with the enemy, do you?
No, I completely agree. That's the essence of good teaching, is being able to respond, to read, to digest what you're seeing, and then to respond. And if it means that you don't get to the end of the page that you hoped you would get to that day, then there's always next lesson, pick up from there. It's better to tailor your instruction to the needs of the group rather than drag them kicking and screaming because of the needs of some arbitrary timeline on your scheme of work.
So I think that almost like the key thing is like, this is not new information. This is almost like a refinement of what we know about effective formative assessment. It's almost like a tempering of expectations and a focus of attention. So I think that's really, really useful on so many levels. Now, you've actually been doing a lot of thinking about this kind of stuff recently on like a massive scale. What have you been working on?
I teach in a school. I work in a classroom. I'm there, and I know the challenges, and I've often thought about digital tools and how they can help us and how they can support us. And over the years and the time I've spent working with teachers all over the world now, I'm trying to think, how can we really help them? How can we make the most of the practice that students are doing, and that data that is gathered, that information, and how can we use that to help us inform so many things, not just our own next steps, but to build a picture of how well those students are doing with particular bits of maths, and are there groups of students that need more support, etc. So I've been working on a tool where pupils basically complete math questions. They can do it digitally, they can do it on paper. If they do it digitally, then that's great because it's already in the system. If they do it on paper, there's a very sort of simple way for teachers to just upload those answers. And what we're doing there is we're creating a situation where every question that a student answers forms a tiny little granule in a much, much bigger picture in terms of their achievement. So I've built something. Its practice is curriculum aligned. So although it was originally kind of aligned for Scottish Curriculum for Excellence, it's actually now lined up with Curriculum for Wales, and also, of course, our own Story of Maths curriculum. So it doesn't really matter massively what curriculum or scheme you're following. The practice is going to be aligned to that. You can do it in any order you want, but it's starting to build that picture and gather that information. And I think importantly here, it's not trying to replace teacher judgment, but what it will do is say, well, actually, this group of students have had 3 goes at this type of question and they've struggled with all of them. So here's half a dozen that you should maybe spend a bit of time with. Or it's going to say, this group of students, they've aced these every time. They've taken no time. They've answered them all right. They're looking to maybe be, like achieve a level or pushed on to something kind of more challenging. But I think what's nice about this is that it helps the teacher. It's like a teaching assistant, I suppose, in a sense, just giving you that info about, where the strengths and weaknesses are, where you should focus your. But it also helps the school, because all of that stuff can just be aggregated up to a sort of school level. And as a school, you can say, well, look at that across the board. We're weak at fractions, or our equations, our expressions and equations are not strong in 5 out of the 6 classes. Well, hang on, what's going on in that 6th class? How come they're getting it right? Maybe we can, it gives a chance for school leaders, and as you go further up, trust or local authority leaders, who will also see that aggregated up across the whole trust, to say, who can we learn from? Not just where are our weaker areas, but where are our strengths? And in that way, what we're moving away from is high stakes, end of topic, end of unit, end of term, end of year tests, which, they're only snapshots. And a lot of those are performative. It's just performance there. It's not really learning. But so often we use those as our kind of, holy grail when we make a decision about how well a student's done. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, sort of end of topic, end of term tests, a lot of that content is forgotten very, very quickly afterwards. Whereas ASO Pro, which is what I've been working on, it's just constantly aggregating data together. It's just building that wonderful big true picture, and then saying to the teacher, these are the things you want to look at, these are the things you want to go, and maybe explore next. So I think something really useful for schools, teachers, and and school groups.
Yeah, it's that trust level and local authority level stuff that excites me, because you can see, how are we doing across the board? Because we started the episode by talking about my travels this week, but everywhere I go, people have the same issue. They do these tests 3 times a year. They either haven't covered half the material, or the pupils are struggling because it's pitched at a level that's not relevant to their actual curriculum sequence. And so there must be a better way. And I think everything we do is based around helping teachers become the most effective versions of themselves. So you said, we've got something for everybody now. We've got the PD in class, developmental, not accountable, sort of focused coaching and math specific rather than the generic pedagogy. We've got the story maths and the tools to help teachers actually be that really effective version. And now ASO Pro, almost like the assessment, but assessment done really, really, really well. I think, yeah. Do you want to tell point in direction? So it's ASO.pro. I'm going to use the phonetic alphabet. So it's Alpha Charlie Echo Lima dot Papa Oscar Romeo. Nope, Papa Romeo Oscar.
That's it. ASL.pro. And there are 3 tours on the site that you can just click through and get a look at it. So if you're a teacher, if you're a school leader, if you're a local authority or trust leader, you can see the different dashboards. But it's all about sort of evidence and action. So this is what the data, this is the data we've gathered. Can we trust it, first of all? Because if it's thin, then ASO Pro will say, well, don't make big decisions based on this. The kids haven't done enough practice. But once the data is, reliable and we can trust it, then it'll always say, this is what we think you should look at next. And, for me, that sounds like our formative assessment conversation. It sounds about, it's not about the techniques, it's not about doing the questions, it's about a decision-making process.
I mean, the amount that your coding has developed over the last couple of years is amazing, because we've always had, people have said, oh, well, with the story maths, can pupils do it? Can we have something pupil facing? Can the pupils log in? Can we get this data? And we said, no, we weren't going to do it until we knew that we had a robust, but essentially you built this, I'm imagining this Fort Knox, but it's like Fort Knox that the Avengers have built, where no one is penetrating the security of this infrastructure. We're actually in Guernsey. Daisy Crystal earlier was talking to us about how essentially Guernsey was a Nazi megastructure, and how they'd poured most of their concrete into the Channel Islands. And this is what I imagine whenever I imagine ASO Pro, but with none of the negative connotations of Nazism and World War II.
Thankfully. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, it's super secure. I mean, that is a key thing when you're looking at the sort of data, etc. So ASO Pro is lean on what it stores, but it's really, really rich in terms of what it gives you back.
Yeah. We could have taken pupil data years ago, but actually we said to schools, no, we can't, because it's one thing having adult data, because most of us adults, our data is in the wild, and we can deal with that in different ways. But pupil data is not fair on them, because in some instances it'll be the first time that their personal data has been somewhere. So I think really useful episode. Really looking forward to sharing it with people. Like I say, I'll be probably crying in a dark corner of a room because it's a sleepover birthday party. So not only will it last most of the day, but it'll also last the whole night too. And my son says the last time he went to a sleepover, it was 1 a.m. and they were still watching the movie. So really do pray for me. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me, Stuart.
You're very welcome, Kieran. It's always a pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.